Okay, we got a couple of your classmates out for COVID self-quarantining, so I'm gonna be getting my arm workout today, holding up stuff. Hopefully this audio comes through whatsoever. If we have to, let me know if the audio quality is bad, if anybody goes back to listen to these. And I'll get a couple of plug-in like lapel mics. Hopefully those will work a little bit better with the little Witten shields or whatever. Cool, so welcome back. Hope you had a good Labor Day weekend, yeah? All right. Did anyone go out to a park or protected area and avail yourself of the many personal, interpersonal, and societal benefits of managed parks?
I went to Giant City.
Giant City, how was it?
Really nice. Had a nice little bonfire.
Okay.
Got to see some stars.
Very cool. Right on. I saw a ton of people out on Crab Orchard this weekend. That was cool. And Rend Lake as well.
Wildlife management.
Say again?
Just a wildlife management area I went to.
Cool.
It's not like a big, it's just Burning Star, a little state park.
Yeah, okay, the old mine, right? Burning Star? Yeah, cool. Okay. We're going to talk more about reclaimed mine land parks and stuff, because that's a thing that's not unique to Southern Illinois, but it's pretty prominent here, like Pyramid and all those. It's different, yeah, and it's a new thing. It is, yeah. It's legally mandated restoration. So there's this, for those of you listening at home, there's this set of legal requirements that surface mine operators have to follow called SMECRA. It's like the Surface Mine Ecology and Reclamation Act or whatever. And there's a bunch of, surface strip and pit mines here in Southern Illinois for the coal seams around here. And those have to be restored to the pre-mining contour, meaning on a topo map, the before and after snapshot, after they remove the coal and then put the overburden, the less valuable stuff back in place. They got to regrade it and rebuild the hills and all that stuff, exactly to what the map looked like before. But it's not solid underlying bedrock under these soils. It's now busted up mine, tailings piles and the overburden, all that stuff. And so the question is, it looks the same on the map, on paper, but do you get that space back? Can you do farming on it? If it was previously farm fields with near surface coal seams, does the water still drain as it used to and stuff like that? Here in the Forestry Department, we've done a ton of research on that stuff, mostly Williard and Schoonover, on some of the old Burning Star and Pyramid State Park and a bunch of the other ones, because they're occasionally required to sort of go back and monitor it and prove that they did a good job in rebuilding it. Very interesting stuff, especially with everything we face with having to rejigger the surface of the planet again for climate change and all that coming up. All right, cool. So that was a productive weekend. Hopefully, if you weren't out recreating, at least got some lab work done or some good holiday weekend paycheck hours. Maybe. You are worth more than you are paid, no matter what, but I hope you at least got some holiday pay. All right, so we were talking about a couple different classes of resources and starting to wrestle with some of these in terms of the particular park that you and your group chose, getting to know a little bit more about them, and starting to interrogate each of these parks for what the reality is like for managing that park in light of the resources that it has. So we'll continue with that today. And we've had a chance to go over geography and topography, so large-scale landscape size stuff, soils. We've talked about water, at least certain impacts to water associated with recreation. And we have not yet talked about vegetation, is that right? Okay, so let's go there, and then we'll move on into wildlife and the human side of things and get up into the atmosphere after that. So that's kind of our roadmap and recap. So for vegetation in parks, we are generally looking for a couple of characteristics that are unique to the living layers of your park. That is, What's the resistance of each species of vegetation in each season? What's the resistance of each of those species across all of those contexts in each season to impacts, that is, any kind of a change, positive or negative, from recreationists? Again, national parks are for non-consumptive forms of recreation. We can't hunt these out to the point that there's no more bison left, right? These are refuges for your wildlife species. The same is true for the plant species involved. These are biorefugia for motile and sessile, that is, mobile and planted species alike. Okay? So what's the resistance to impact? Can you run 1 million visitors walking through the grass, single file in your mind's eye, over the root wad of any of these tree species around us here outside the engineering building, and the tree is fine after 1 million footfalls on its root wad? Or is the resistance of maybe some other trees or other vegetative species like forest forbs, like ferns, for example, non-woody species, is their resistance to impact so low that you're going to bend over that stalk and break it off with the first footfall across it? That's a very low resistance case. It can survive only 0 trampling passes over it in the technical jargon of recreation impacts. Okay? So, what's the resistance of each species in each season at your park relative to all of the different kinds of pressures or impacts that visitors may inadvertently want to bring, like getting stepped on? Or is it resistant to being culled for firewood over and over and over? Some species can handle getting limbed for lower limbs up to about 6-7 feet high, right? We'll break off or saw off stuff when people are not using leave no trace to make a campfire, which is a very understandable, normal, basic human motivation to have warmth and light and fire around which to have the beers that you backpacked out to your backcountry campsite, or making s'mores, or telling ghost stories, or cuddling up and, looking up at the stars, looking for shooting stars with your significant other, or whatever. What's the resistance of each of those species for each season that it's in its climate and ecoregion, right? Across each of the different kinds of recreation that people want to use that vegetative species for resistance. The other half of the coin, or the other face of the coin for wildlife and for vegetative species, is resilience. What kind of resources does each of these, not species, but individual organisms at that level, what biological reserves, what energy storage in the root wad does each of these trees have for when we snap off or saw off some limbs, sort of ignorantly using unseasoned, sap-filled wood to try and build a campfire with, and it's frustrating and it doesn't work, and we should have just got some bundles back in town before we headed in, and you're just like your father and blah, 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 and people get mad, and it's not the tree's fault that we're trying to build a campfire wrong here. But the tree does now need to cope with that injury, that wound site of the amputated limb. What reserves does it have to do that? Some species, you could knock them back and they will come back all the time. Grassoids, sedges, graminoids. For those of you who've taken any turf classes, for example, extremely resistant to trampling. There's a reason that we have sports fields covered in grass. You're going to run all over them with cleats all day long, and they're kind of fine, as long as you're, giving plenty of nutrients and water and not tearing up the field when it's wet and so forth. Lots of resistance to impacts. Grasses, sedges, other graminoids, bamboos, stuff like that, as long as they have a non-woody life form that can prostrate, that is, lay flat and then spring back up after the trampling pressure is gone, that goes a long way in increasing that particular species and that individual organisms within that species' resilience. because it's a lot easier to heal over a couple of cells damaged by stepping on a leaf of or blade of grass in soft soils. It doesn't take much for it to spring back up an hour later, sort of bolstered by the wind, and continue collecting sunlight, converting that to sugars as biological reserve, as metabolic reserve. Okay? Pretty straightforward, but incredibly useful, like omnipresently useful characteristics. No matter what your park is, you got to know the basic sense of what's the resistance of each of these species, what's the use pressure, how much do people want to be trampling, walking, riding off-road motorcycles, riding bicycles, riding pack animals, horses, and so trail riding horses over that particular species, okay? And then what is the resilience of that species? So we can anybody think of an example of a species that is resistant to impact but not resilient? It can resist a lot of damage, a lot of pressure, a lot of impact, but once that's overwhelmed, it's dead. It's just gone. Anybody think of any vegetative species? It could be a tree, this is a forestry program, or non-tree vegetation that's resistant but not very resilient. And we're purposely kind of holding back from putting specific numeric ranges on this in terms of number of tramples per season. That's more of a graduate level concern. We're just getting for the concept right now. Anybody think of a species that is resistant but not resilient in vegetation relative to recreation impacts? Second? Maples, all right. I agree with you. Explain why just a maple from that family is resistant but not particularly resilient.
Coming from like a walking path, I'm not too sure, but like I've tapped a lot of maples and they're pretty resilient in scarring over their insert holes for where we tap and make like the syrup from. But they can still get sick or injured from that tapping process and die.
Okay. And that tiny little tap hole is the vector for infection to kill the entire organism, right? Yeah. Okay, so it might be 1/10,000th the mass of the tree or less, tapped or drilled out to get that recreational function out of the tree, but that leads to injury, pathology, and eventually death in some cases. Okay, so to the extent that any vegetative species is kind of human-sized down to about the size of your fist, and it is woody, that makes it in that range, in that size range. Anything bigger than a person is probably not going to face a lot of trampling injury, unless it's a specifically shallow-rooted species like giant sequoia, like redwoods we were talking about last week. Okay? We're not going to step on this tree right here enough times to kill it on the tree above ground, because we can't step on that tree. It's too big. Also, if it's too small, if it's smaller than the lug pattern, if it doesn't grow as high as the cavities in the lug pattern, so for those of you interested in shooting sports, smaller than the grooves, taller than the lands on the sole of your shoe, you can step on it, and if it's in that space in between, it never got trampled on. Does that make sense? Like your boot sole pattern, the tread pattern, is elevating you off of that plant even though you're stepping on it. So very, very tiny plants are sort of de facto very resistant to damage. Anything that grows inside of a crack in the rocks but doesn't grow much larger than the depth of the crack, you can step right on that crack and not actually put any injury or pressure on the plant. Okay? So size has a lot to do with governing the resistance of a species to impact by making it vulnerable or not vulnerable at all in the first place. Growth location is another one. So for trees, shrubs, other woody species that are obligate to live in really pretty flat, mesic, so halfway well-drained terrain, they're probably going to be more vulnerable. Most of us are going to be walking cross-country in flatter areas like this lawn that's around us, in the absence of all the sidewalks around us. We like walking on relatively flat terrain when we're out recreating. We like riding across relatively flatter terrain as well. So that decreases the resistance by making it more likely to have the trampling pressure in that place in the first place, okay? But that's a characteristic of each of these species. Do they prefer steep, inaccessible slopes that very, very few people are ever going to physically touch? Or do they prefer or require, they have a lesser sort of competitive strategy and they're more vulnerable to where people want to go recreate? Okay? Can anybody think of a species that is, vegetative species, that is not at all resistant to impacts? Like it gets busted up the moment you breathe near it, but it's pretty resilient. It's the kind of organism, vegetative organism, that has a great capacity to spring back, even though it can't protect itself by being large and armored like a full-size mature tree, or very, very small, like something that's too small for us to even step on or drive over. Anybody think of a species that is low resistance, high resilience? Grasses. Yeah, you got it. Okay, good one. How about fungi? So it doesn't take much of a step to crush newly sprouted fungal heads, right? I mean, a single step is going to destroy that structure. But where you see those fungal heads popping up, mycelium's already all throughout that down log, and it's going to spring back the next year. Like, you couldn't trample that log enough to completely sterilize it from all those spores and the mycelium that's grown through it. Okay? So, we have species that are strong resistance, strong resilience, weak resistance, weak resilience, just eternally fragile species that just require a lot of conservation or preservation protection. And then we got high resistance, low resistance, high resistance, low resilience, and vice versa, and so forth. The whole sort of Punnett square is possible. So for your park, you want to think about, okay, what are the species, kind of the dominant species of interest here? And what are the species of interest that are not dominant? Those are likely to be the ones that are rare, threatened, or endangered, so listed federally some way, or state listed in the state occupying your park. And so for the dominant species, the fragile, rare, threatened, or endangered species, and then the keystone or linchpin type species that may or may not be resistant or resilient to impacts one way or the other, but everything else in the ecosystem does depend on them. So if there is a problem of recreation pressure, of impacts on those, it's not that they're super rare, it's just that everything else kind of depends on them. We want to pay attention to kind of those three kinds of vegetation at your park for this semester. Okay? So, you guys have, kind of the rest of the semester to look this up, but is anybody aware of any species at your park that, you probably want to pay attention to? Here's a pro tip. If there is a vegetation species listed in the name for your park, like a Joshua tree, we probably really got to do a good job, not that anybody here has chosen Joshua tree, but we probably really got to do a good job of preserving those Joshua trees from recreation impacts. Because if you lose an iconic species like that, one where it's kind of a famous species, well then that puts a lot of very negative attention on your management efforts, okay? So whether or not those are ecologically important, they tend to be, but whether or not those are ecologically important, they're also important for kind of the perception of your management beyond the actual day-to-day mechanics of it. All right? So, anybody think of any species that are of particular importance for making sure that they don't take the brunt of recreation impacts at your park? or protected area?
Hibiscus flowers.
Hibiscus flowers. Okay, are they resistant to impacts?
No.
You couldn't like drive a off-road motorcycle over hibiscus flowers and
They'd
be
probably
fine?
crush them.
Probably.
And whatever's underneath the soil, the root system and stuff. Like,
Yeah.
even if there's a whole bunch of them, still the rooting system's probably real small.
Okay. You got it. Slow-growing species. So on the Shawnee National Forest, anybody know of any really slow-growing species that are getting poached and sold for $1,000 a pound on the Asian black market?
Oh yeah, ginseng.
Ginseng. Yeah. How long does it take a ginseng root to grow to the size of being harvestable? Pardon?
I assume a long time.
Yeah, over a decade. So this is not an easily farmable crop. There's farmed ginseng, but a lot of people say that it tastes different, it doesn't work as well in sort of the traditional medicine applications that it's used. And you see farmed ginseng in a lot of like tea bags, for example, that sort of thing. But the wild grown stuff is superior in every way, and it's also super lucrative. I mean, $1,000 a pound. I've seen firsthand people getting dragged out by their heel by law enforcement officers out of the Shawnee National Forest trying to poach ginseng. It's that valuable. Like, it's worth it. You know, those guys can afford bail after they sell a bunch of illegally harvested ginseng. So that can be an issue as well. Is there an economic use of any of your vegetative species? One of the economic uses of tree species that we're going to see at Mammoth Cave that sort of brings them very much in focus for illegal poaching is burl wood. Everybody knows what burls are? Anybody not familiar with that term?
Are they like the kind of knots that form on trees?
Yeah. So it's a big canker basically on the tree. It's usually a non-tumorous, non-teratogenic growth. Typically, it's like the tree trying to heal over a viral infection at a wound site. Fungi colonizing, attacking can cause it. That's a little bit less common. Insects, very commonly. If they hit a tree real hard in one spot and then move on, the tree will grow over, and it creates this big sort of lump. But the growth pattern isn't regular rings, according to the rainfall pattern annually. It's this chaotic swirls, and the tissue, the living outer shell of the tree sort of growing over itself in a very sort of end stages Akira, like bloating into this weird monstrous shape. Anyway, if you cut those off with a chainsaw, those can be worth many, many, many thousands of dollars depending on their size and the species that's taken. So like a walnut or a chestnut burl, you could get tens of thousands of dollars out of a single burl the size of your torso. You slice it real, real thinly, and you make super expensive furniture out of it, basically. So that, an otherwise healthy tree that just happens to have a burl growth on it is extremely vulnerable, not so much to wreck impact, but to straight up illegal culling. And it's hard to catch tree poachers because they can backpack a chainsaw in, and they can backpack the burl out, and if nobody was there to hear it, then you might catch it a year or 2 or 5 later. So we'll see a couple of huge burls that have been protected since the park was created, but that's a constant sort of enforcement issue. All right. Is anybody aware of any species? This is a very specific question that we haven't had a chance to research yet, so no worries if you don't know this yet. Aware of any vegetative species in your park that has particularly broad and sometimes flat, usually fleshy or succulent leaves, like agave or yucca or aloe, anything like that? If your park is a little bit more of a tropical park, you're much more likely to have these.
Like a mango? That's not really succulent.
Yeah, kind of, sort of. I'm thinking more of the leaf structure, less than the woody part of it in this case. So if you've mostly traveled and lived around the Midwest, we've got relatively few examples of this. But but think of cactus species that have needles here and there instead of like carpeting across the whole thing. Or, spider plants and stuff like that have like real thick stalk, like fleshy leaves instead of thin deciduous leaves like on these trees around us. So the idea here is that some visitors to your park, in the process of doing recreation, out for a hike or camping with their family or whatever, they'll see that plant not as a member of the biological community, providing important ecosystem services and aesthetic services to you as a recreationist, and blotting out noise and so forth from other recreationists. They'll see it as a canvas, and they'll carve into the plant. So, for larger, succulent, fleshy-leaved plants that have large, flattish, open spaces you could easily carve into with a knife and say, Dr. Park was here 2021 YOLO. This plant graffiti is a thing. And it becomes a self-reinforcing or an accelerating problem, because after the first person sees that somebody else left graffiti, even if they didn't get away with it, but the artifact of that impact is still there, that wound on the plant has scarred over and is still there with fibrous tissue, the next person has what's called a psychological releaser cue. It's a prompt to say, oh, well, somebody else did it, you could do that too. Or that's appropriate for this space, you could do it as well. So, think about that particular kind of, usually they're drought-tolerant, semi-arid type species or tropical species that have fleshy leaves to store a bunch of fluid in, fluid and nutrients. The other way this happens is, could you think of one or a couple tree species that have very light-colored, thin, smooth bark that looks like a piece of paper or a chalkboard to leave a message on? Beech. Yeah, anything else? Aspen. Anything else? Anything else in Southern Illinois?
Some parts of a sycamore tree.
Some parts of a sycamore, exactly. Some species of birch, depending on their maturity and stuff like that. And we've all seen tree graffiti, right? It's all over Thompson Woods and so forth. We don't need to go back to that 220 level call out. But think about the cocktail of tree species that are in your park and close to trailheads and trail networks, all right? If all of your trails are way, way down in elevation and nobody is actually up walking among the aspen, then your aspen are probably safe. And your aspen are probably extra safe since they can reproduce clonally and so forth and just be like an entire grove of one organism genetically. It's a good competitive strategy for them to survive. But other species, not so much. A lot of beech species really struggle with this, and you can see with really old carved up beech individuals how that can create some of those cankers and burls and grown over wound sites on those. If you carve a little square in the side of a beech tree, or your initials or whatever, or your initials X so-and-so, other initials, and then like the 2-digit year and something like that, and you come back 50 years later, it's not just that area that's still scarred over and weakened structurally and vulnerable to incursion by insects and viruses and so forth. It's that whole area that's sort of bubbled up around it as well. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So a lot of the vegetative impacts are going to boil down to kind of overuse or over-intensive, too dense of use, so too many users in too small of a space, trampling, or it's going to be depreciative behavior like graffiti on the tree. It's going to be ill-informed or ignorant or uncaring firewood gathering, which is kind of a double stack on impacts because we're walking out and back, and in some cases, instead of gathering sustainable sort of dead down wood no thicker than your wrist, like Leave No Trace would specify, people are snapping off live green branches and trying to bring those back, and they won't light because they're full of sap anyway, and so forth. So you get the trampling and the injury and the loss of those nutrients around a lot of developed campgrounds, like at Mammoth Cave, we'll see forests that are in no sense healthy or sustainable in terms of nutrient cycling, because within about 30 feet on the outside edge or buffer or ring around each one of the, 150 or so campsites there's no firewood left to gather. And then 30 to 60 feet out, there's a little bit of firewood. And then 60 to 90 feet out, there's some firewood, but we'll find a lot of little trails going out that people have walked out and back to get firewood, even though there's firewood like 100 yards away at the camp store for a couple of bucks and so forth, okay? But a lot of folks enjoy getting firewood. A lot of folks enjoy having a fire. So vegetative species come under that consumptive use pressure, even in parks where consumptive use shouldn't be a thing. So anybody ever been to a place where you were not allowed to gather firewood, but you were allowed to bring in cut firewood? Anybody? Okay. Where was that? Do you remember?
Devil's Lake State Park.
Devil's Lake State Park in Wisconsin. All right. Pretty forested area?
Yeah.
Okay. For those of you who went out west on summer camp, a lot of the places we went to, you were not allowed to gather firewood. And you could use a camp stove, which is a contained self-fueled fire source and heat source and so forth. And in some places, you're not even allowed to do that because the recreation impact would be, of course, wildfires jumping from even a stove or a cigarette or a recreation toy hauler trailer with a flat and the rim is dragging on the asphalt and throwing sparks off onto the side of the road. Very, very common sources of wildfires. So all of these are kind of the usual suspects for plants in your park. Okay? So we want to think about, relative to our class exercise of last week and the week before, of laying a trail in. And we talked about draping the trail on the upslope side to protect the root structures. Does our trail network bring us close to stands of beech, birch, aspen, sycamore? Or does it intelligently route away from those? Close enough that you could see those trees and appreciate them and enjoy them and get all the benefits of them, but not close enough where it's easy or automatic or appealing to carve your name into one of those trees. All right? Cool. One further wrinkle on little spider. For those of you listening at home, there's a small spider accosting one of your classmates. This conversation almost became a confrontation, as they'd say in Letterkenny. One other factor that we want to wrestle with in terms of trees and impacts from recreation is, what's their elevation? What's their placement on the landscape? If they're right at the edge of a non-ephemeral water body, meaning like a permanent stream, lake, pond, river, that soil is saturated, meaning full of water. All the macro pores in the soil are filled with water. The soil is very soft, and therefore the roots can be easily exposed and damaged. So shoreline recreation, we gotta be very, very, very careful of in terms of number of people per unit area. Very low use density, if at all. Or separate it, like with the boardwalk some of you guys were wrestling with on our trails exercise. At the opposite end, instead of being down at the very bottom at the edge of a water course, at the top end of the tree line, the most difficult sort of elevation band for vegetation species to grow in is going to be where the oxygen is thin, where impacts from storms and so forth are going to be brutal, where the mechanical freeze-thaw at tree line is going to be absolutely just wrecking the soil out of which, or the bedrock out of which some of these trees are trying to grow. Okay? Has anybody been up to tree line and seen trees that are about this high, and you know for a fact, as a forester, that 2.5 foot high tree is like 150 years old? Has anybody ever seen crumholes before? No? Okay. We drove by this, we went up and above tree line, and then back down at Rocky Mountain National Park on summer camp this past year. So we saw this, but we were in a vehicle trying to keep on moving and so forth before people got sick from being at 12,000 feet elevation. So you may not have remembered that. It's pretty quick. But it's a pretty sharp transition from like montane forests to a thin band of crumb holes, these tiny little trees that are just barely hanging on, and then up to alpine tundra where it's just grassy species and lichen and so forth, and then up into the cryosphere where it's just rocks and ice up past that, and the Rockies and other places like that. But that's the other place where your trees are going to be really, really vulnerable to impacts because, in a century and a half of growth, the growth conditions, the season is so short, the nutrient availability is so low in those montane, high elevation soils that it took 150 years to get 2.5 feet high. If somebody slips on the trail because it's a rough, rocky trail and it's wet because you're up in the clouds and try to panic stop by grabbing onto that tree, you can rip that tree physically out of the ground, and it's 150 years old. It's kind of the only place or the only sort of ecotone, sort of a boundary between two ecosystems, alpine tundra and montane, where you could do something like that, rip a tree out with a panic stop fall. That's 150 years old. Okay? So, interrogate your park in your mind's eye. Think about your landscape for just a moment. Do I have an alpine transition zone where I need to be very cognizant of my trails not running along that crumb holes band and continually exposing visitors and trees to each other? Do I go up and cross that very, very fragile ecotone real quickly, just shooting up and out of it and away from those vulnerable trees as quickly and sustainably as possible? Or is my park low enough elevation that that's a moot point and I've got that box kind of checked by default, good to go? Do you have any permanent water bodies with any shoreline? Your vegetative species are super vulnerable there because shoreline has a lot going on with it in terms of recreation, shore fishing, bird watching, all of the stuff that you can do right from the shoreline and that you want to do specifically right from the shoreline. It's just that's not a very resistant combination of species beyond each individual species present because of the soil's saturation and lack of resistance to shearing and stepping in it and creating holes. Cool. That's pretty much the injury side of your vegetation resources with respect to recreation use. One thing we got to worry about, because it's recreation, is people changing the species composition by adding vegetative species to your park that weren't there before. So any guesses on how this happens? Your humans, your visitors, the people that you're trying to manage for, that you're required as National Park Service folks for this semester, required by the 1916 Organic Act to provide high-quality recreation access and opportunities. And these are the same people that are bringing in invasive species. Why would they do this? How do they do this?
Their shoes and tires.
Shoes, tires, and sometimes your animal's droppings, depending on the animal. Okay? Firewood, yeah. So we've all seen the, don't transport firewood across county lines, state lines, whatever. The emerald ash borer is wrecking face. There are a lot of species like that, and those signs get pretty in your face in places out west where the pine beetles are already just dominating forests and changing forest compositions almost completely. Okay? So, one specific way that this happens in forest recreation that we don't generally have to think about in any other branch of in forest management is think about the grasses that you have growing on either side of your trail, leaning over into the trail, and somebody walking down that trail first thing in the morning when there might be a little bit of dew or condensation on those seeded out grass heads or at the ends of the stalks. So your boot knocks a couple of seeds off, and you don't even have to kick it hard, just like brushing against it. When those seeds are ready to go, they're ready to drop. And if your boots or your jeans are a little bit wet, they're just a little bit sticky. Maybe they've even got some mud on them, and that'll carry those seeded out grass seeds not real far. but they don't have to go real far. So on the Shawnee, the way this takes shape is Japanese stilt grass, or because it's 2021 and people make racist statements based on species names and where stuff comes from, Microstegium viminium. It's an extremely, extremely thick-growing, aggressively invasive grass that got into the Shawnee and grows typically near a trailhead right at the side of the trail. It's a disturbance-happy species. It's a little bit like poison ivy in that it likes the edge of a trail as a disturbance area, right? You've cut a scar through the forest to put this trail in. And then folks go walking or riding their vehicles or their horses down this trail in the morning, and Microstegium produces a lot of seeds. And even if you just kick it 50 feet down the trail before your boots immediately start drying off and the seeds fall off just 50 feet down, the next season, everywhere from the edge of that patch of Microstegium viminium all the way out to that 50-foot point, that's now the next generation. So now you've got 100 feet, let's say, of seed contribution, and that's twice as much seed load that gets hopscotched down the trail, as well as growing out aggressively from the side of the trail into the forest. So, if you have your notes out, give yourself space for about a half-page size line graph. Okay. We're going to graph the density of Microstegium viminium, according to research, as a function of distance from the center line of the trail. Okay. So, draw a half-page x-axis and y-axis in your notebook. Label the x-axis distance from trail center line. We always use units, so put in parentheses little m for meters. And where the x-axis crosses your eventual y-axis, over on that left-hand side, usually where that little red vertical line is on your notebook, label that 0 meters. And at the far right side of the graph, over by the right side margin, you may or may not have a faint red line on that side. At that point, label 500 meters. On the y-axis, following along the vertical red line on the left side of your notebook page, go ahead and construct that axis line about half-page height, 5 inches high. And then label that axis Microstegium viminium forest floor cover, in parentheses, percentage is our unit. Okay. So, even after one season of infiltration, you're going to get a graph that starts at, not at 100% at 0 meters, 100% forest floor cover at 0.5 meters, because the center line of the trail is going to have 0 vegetation cover. It's the trail. People are trampling stuff. Nothing's going to grow there. You've compacted that surface so that nothing can grow there, and that water will drain off it quickly and easily instead of infiltrating and making it soft. Okay. At 1/2 meter distance from the trail center line, so real close to the left side of your graph, but not quite at the left side, I want to mark that as 100% cover. It's a real dense growing, thick grass. Grows up to a couple of feet long, and it's a real just dense clump. Numerous blades growing up out of the ground per square decimeter, or 10 centimeters square to the side. Okay? So it grows up real thickly. It grows up so competitively and thickly that nothing else can grow nearby. It's sucking out all the nutrients and shading out all of the downward pointed nutrients, precip and sunlight. Nothing else can compete with that. Not for long. From that 100% at the far end of the graph, at 500 meters, we're going to have just a smidgen above 0% forest floor cover. It takes Microstegium viminium a lot of effort to grow sideways through a shaded forest canopy down on the forest floor. It doesn't have a good competitive strategy for that, but it will do it. It absolutely will do it. It shades out everything as it goes and just keeps growing sideways until it's the whole forest floor. Okay? Connecting those 2 points, draw an exponentially decreasing line. So not a straight line from 100% cover down to that near zero, but kind of a curving dip. Okay? That's an exponential decrease curve. For those of you who are listening at home and who also happen to be PhD students interested in model building, the cumulative distribution function is the exact opposite shape. It is a logistic upward trending curve. All right, so curving down and approaching zero from 100%, connect those 2 points. That's what you're up against when your visitors accidentally, nobody is running around twirling the mustache going, I'm the eco-villain spreading Microstegium viminium. Nobody's doing that. But unknowingly, some visitors are going to do this. And that Microstegium, those seeds can come in on horse poop and be perfectly viable, get pooped out on the trail at random 5 miles in, and one year you just have an explosion of this stuff like a tumor that's popped up in the middle of your forest out of nowhere. And it was last year's poop that dropped a seed at the side of the trail, and the seed was viable, and now it's tuft, and it got a couple of years to explode outward from there, growing exponentially. So, this stuff dries out in the winter and forms a thatch, which is a real thick kind of cross-hatching of dried out kind of straw-looking stalks that's still so thick it will shade out everything that's trying to grow nearby. And that's a problem if you want to use wildland fire management, because this stuff puts a lot of fuel in a small amount of space real quickly when it's in its thatch stage. And generally we're trying to burn in a controlled way places like the Shawnee during what seasons? When is a good time for a controlled burn on the Shawnee? Anybody taking wildland fire management yet? Okay. When are you generally, as the burn boss, planning a burn for, temperate Midwest forests? Is it middle of the winter? Is it middle of the summer? Spring or fall? What was it? Spring or fall? Okay. Yeah. So spring before or after everything started leafing out? While it's still kind of brown looking in spring, or when it's like that bright, vibrant, early growth green spring? Depends on what you're burning for, yeah? Yeah. So we've got, every spring, we've got lots and lots of last winter's thatch from Microstegium viminium all over the place. And this stuff is aggressively dumping seeds into the seed bank. So if you manage to get a fire through that area, there's still Microstegium seeds ready to sprout out afterwards and reestablish after that fire. So you get into this tricky situation of, generally, are we burning a place over and over every single spring? Or do we have kind of a longer burn interval? Usually. I mean, every place is different, but generally burning every year or not so much every year? Yeah, every other year, every third year, something like that. Sometimes as few as every 5 if it's a less productive environment. Microstegium is on an annual clock. It is aggressively trying to reestablish after every burn. So this is tricky, and it gets transported by recreation use, which is why sometimes, in order to protect certain forest ecosystems and be a functional recreation manager, you got to think about where do I want to increase my risk of having to do a bunch of aggressive microstegium landscape management and removal versus where do my visitors want to go recreate? Where do they want to ride or walk along a trail? Where do they want to camp? Because those two things, they love each other. We love camping in open campsites. That's all edge habitat. Microstegium is here for it. And if you throw down your little tent on a patch of microstegium and it gets any of the transpirated moisture overnight up through the bottom of the tent, you're probably taking seeds with you, right? And then throwing your tent down in the next place, somewhere else in the forest, and dropping a bunch of seeds there that you packed up and rolled up and obligingly carried for the plant across the forest. So sometimes the best trail management is removing the trail, okay? We don't want to fall into the kind of the typical engineer's trap of, all right, now we got a couple of good techniques kind of started, that is 7.5% max slope, or the what slope alignment angle rule that we worked on last Wednesday. Remember that one? It was the something slope alignment angle. Say again? Trail slope alignment angle. That's right. Not a trick question. Very good. Okay. But once we got those techniques, we might fall into the easy trap of like every hillside you see is just a potential trail waiting to get built. But at the same time, we got to understand our vegetation resources and realizing that, man, sometimes these trails are literally the problem, or at least they're the vector for the problem. They create the ability for certain species to exploit the natural community that you're trying to protect. Okay? Cool. So we got graffiti. We've got prize specimen removal with tree burl poaching. We've got non-native invasive species exploiting humans, riding on our backs or in our packs or on our boots to help them seed out. It's like any grass's wildest sexual fantasy to have other folks like spreading seed all over the place for free, right? And recreation, we are the vanguard of that problem. So sometimes you gotta make some hard trade-off decisions of, yeah, there's this beautiful, beautiful lake that I know all of my visitors would love. And that in conversations and in surveys and in feedback forms and so forth with them, they say, hey, we are here for that beautiful shoreline and the fishing and so forth, but I know if I bring a trail through this area or that area, that ecosystem just cannot fend off something like Microstegium viminium. And with our extremely mobile, cheap, but dirty, energy-based economy, people going farther, more often, for cheaper is kind of the story of American recreation development over the second half of the 20th century and up till now. Putting in more trails to more places, carving up chunks of habitat with roads and campgrounds and stuff like that, and letting some invasive species get in. Now, a lot of the time, if we don't have folks transporting non-natives in or opportunistically just walking along a trail with us like poison ivy does, it's going to be kind of the opposite. So for those of you who love doing ecological restoration, pulling out non-native species, seeding in local prairie wildflowers, burning regularly to take it back to prairie, stuff like that, that's very much right here in this space as well. So a lot of our parks, probably your national park, had some prior human land use history that was more just like subsistence, nomadic Native American groups in the Great Plains, for example, or agronomy-based, family farms. The Shawnee is almost exclusively old farmland, and so forth. And there, the vegetation operations are to either passively let afforestation bring it back to, central hardwoods, basically, here in the Midwest, or whatever species are native, or actively going through and using burn management, using reseeding, using herbicide, mechanical removal, like a gyro track in Thompson Woods, to pull out some of those non-native species and give the natives more of a chance to compete on even footing vegetatively, so to speak. So was anybody here, maybe not, as a student when the university paid some folks to gyro track through Thompson Woods? Does everybody know what a gyro track even is? Okay, is everybody familiar with what a bobcat is, or a skid steer? All right, take one of those, pull the bucket scoop off the front, put a big mulching wheel on it with huge blades, and hook up the hydraulic sort of power source there to a fairly high-speed geared energy transfer system, and then put that thing in drive and just go forward. So a gyro track is basically one of those stick blenders with wheels or tracks on it, and you just like drive forward and you just destroy everything that you drive across. It's this big mulching wheel that's spinning super hard and fast, and the goal here isn't to extract timber, so you're not like gently chopping each of these off at the stump and felling it and extracting it. You're just like mowing through trees and like stuff's falling on you, going through. It's a blast. They're doing it out of Touch of Nature now to get rid of some of the autumn olive out there. You may have heard of that stuff as a non-native species here. So yeah, whether it's trying to combat the sometimes occasional, pretty diffuse, kind of low-key until it really gets a hold, non-native seeds getting brought into a place, or if you're trying to get rid of historic invasive species or planted species mechanically with a gyro track or with fire or herbicides or whatever, or integrated pest management. This is very much day-to-day kind of grounds work for a national park in a big way. And the goal is to get it to put in the big effort, get those species out, knock them back over and over to the point that the seed bank is depleted, to where now we can let much more natural processes, much cheaper, more hands-off processes, kind of reforest or revegetate with the species that we've left behind or that we're encouraging. Okay? Cool. All right, so that's the super short introduction to the vegetation side of resources. Any questions on that stuff so far? We've got a couple of impact mechanisms, a couple of usual suspects, a couple of places to pay extra attention to with these resources. Any questions? All right, cool. We'll take about a 5-minute break, so stretch your legs, get some water. It's kind of dry today, so whatever you need. And we'll come back here. It is 3:02. How about at 10 after, 7-minute break? Cool. We'll start our hands-on stuff next.
What about an area like got those trees that are resistant to flooding, but they got those paths that you can walk down. Usually like a wood bridge. How do those trees usually survive that long? Just the way they structure the trail, or
Yeah. Anything under a certain size, like in the line of the trail, certainly, but usually you'd wrap the trail around them. Anything under a certain size doesn't have a deep enough root wad to withstand, even like, especially a constructed, subgrade, grade, crowned, hiked, constructed trail. Everything over most species over a certain size have an enormous root wad, just as much biomass underground as they do above, and the trail is a really pretty small part of their footprint. So it's a problem, but you can totally get away with it for trees of this size, and so forth. It's not a big deal. But it's a question of extent. So we've probably seen like urban sidewalks like tree lined. So one of the weird things that researchers found when they started studying trees in an urban context is the amount of money and the amount of time that people spend in your business district. If you're running a small town or city or whatever, it goes up very tightly coupled with the number and age and density of the trees that you have planted along the sidewalk. But you got street on this side, you got sidewalk and building foundation on this side, and there's just not a lot of space underground for those trees to have functional soil. So you see a lot of tree replacement happening, but it ends up even being like revenue positive because you plant the trees, you get a lot of extra tax money from the merchants who are, bringing in sales tax revenue to you, the city. And so when one of these trees gets a little bit too big for that tiny little hole that it's grown up through, chop it down, plant a new one, and keep it going. Yeah, it's weird. Like, it works really, really well.
you think building in an area with all the trees is hard on the environment, but I guess the way they can kind of replenish it that way.
Yeah, it's totally artificial, right? I mean, they're taking farmed saplings, sticking them in basically large pots, and pulling them out every 10, 15 years, whatever. And as long as you're not using species that'll like jump their containment, and, like buckle the sidewalk and stuff, and destroy the foundation, it works fine. It's a win-win. I mean, I know that I'm biased. Like, trees are the answer, but. Like, it actually works. Like, you can do the math and you make more money planting the trees. It's weird. So.
Are you talking about those trails like a bald apple?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Cypress trees. Or the bald knob. What about like lookouts in national parks, right? They got these little pull-offs you can, like on the kind of like the driving trail, you can pull off.
Yes!
So
Let's talk about that when everybody gets back.
Okay,
That's perfect. It's a perfect application.
So at the Smoky Mountain National Park, I know you got that roadway system, and every so often you got these little pull-outs. I was wondering how that kind of affected.
Yeah, Shenandoah National Park, the Skyline Drive up there has over 100 of them. That's pretty common. And everybody's like, oh man, it's the most beautiful drive in the world. Everything's so natural all around you. And the whole thing is like, it's a garden level manicured landscape to provide all this for you. Like
around the cart.
Yeah. But done right, like people don't feel like they're in a garden. It feels like you're just driving through the forest, And then the trees around the bend just like open up and you see the whole valley across the way.
Yeah, it's like you brought up Bald Knob at that cross. Very close to that cross, there's like a little, down the road, there's like a little pull out. You can there's like a little space in between the trees. You can see the whole.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I figured that was probably one of those. It's like a little dirt pull off around a tree.
But like at summer camp, when we had lunch that one day down past Makanda, just had lunch on that little cliff, and it's looking out over the whole area, and you look down and you see the tops of some trees, and if you look real closely, you can see a bunch of trees that were removed to like preserve that view, not so much the natural environment. It's fine because it's right at the edge, and there's a gazillion other trees in the valley, but in some other places where it's a little bit more borderline, like a semi-arid area, you don't get to do that. But yeah, that's probably where we're going. So. He's a pretty smart guy. You should definitely have him on your team if he's not. Just okay, we'll start here in about a minute. Maybe let's get everybody back. All right, grab your stuff. We'll go on just a short kind of show and tell walk with some applications of what we were just talking about in the first half. And I think that'll be our day for today for the most part. So we'll try and end a little bit early. We need to get somewhere. All right, so let's talk about this interaction of kind of last week's topic, recreation water resources. Here, come across the path. We'll talk about recreation water resources, and then we'll talk about the interface of, in particular, the root wads of the vegetation resources and how they stabilize soils around those saturated soils. So, here we've got, just in this kind of 50-foot stretch of shoreline, we've got a bunch of different situations here in terms of recreation opportunities, how you and I see this landscape kind of transactionally in terms of what can this spot in a forested environment do for me today for recreation. So right here, the cypress tree is not going to be able to provide a sort of a nice open spot to cast a shoreline for some just casual fishing and stuff like that. I'm going to keep getting foul and into it and stuff like that. So if I want to do fishing as my activity in this forested and water ecotone, or again, boundary or transition zone between two ecosystems, this is kind of a bad fit for me. It's a bad opportunity. Even though the quality of the resource is really good, it doesn't match my motivation, my reason for being here. We'll talk more about the human sort of mind and how we think about this stuff as we go. But suffice it to say that, not the right opportunity for that activity. Can anybody think of a forest rec activity that is perfectly suited for this little grassy opening right at the shoreline here? What might work really well, even though shore casting, fishing, definitely not right. Hunting. What else? Kayaking. No, yeah. Exactly. This is a great spot to launch a kayak because you don't even have to get your feet muddy, and that's normally a thing for kayaking, right? It's just you got about a 6-inch drop between the lowest walkable section of dry soil and the surface of the water at max waterline here, at max fill. So, not all activities are created equal in terms of equivalent spaces. Our vegetation resources here are going to be serving some ecosystem services. As we head down to launch our kayak into this space, we're going to, don't get in somebody else's personal airshed and share your code with them, but kind of file right through here so you can get a real close look at what's happening in about this 2-meter stretch of bank line right here. Assuming we'd, walk our kayak in from parking our trailer right over there 50 yards away, schlep the kayak to this point, drag it, carry it, and then launch cleanly from here. So take a second to just kind of walk through the spot, observe what's present in terms of the physical resources. Some of it you can't see until you're right on top of it. All right, once you've had a good chance to kind of take a look, make a hole for the next person so they can. And we'll debrief in a sec. All right, everybody having a pretty okay chance to take a peek? Cool. All right, so one of the functions of a recreation resource manager, a resource ranger versus a rec ranger versus an interp ranger versus a law enforcement ranger versus a backcountry ranger, different flavors of ranger all need to be able to take a look at a spot like this and just kind of mentally automatically cataloging what species are present, what landform resistance and resilience from recreation presence and uses and impacts, what's kind of the story in this spot. So launching, recovering a kayak from here, pretty good fit, yeah? What about 50 million kayaks over the course of 10 years? Pretty good fit? Not so much. Okay, why not?
Soil structure right there.
Totally agree.
A lot of grass species, but
Yeah.
over time.
So that's gonna denude this area. It's gonna stop the biological function in the spot. All of that soil has to go somewhere. It's gonna fill in this, in this case, man-made body of water. And that's gonna shorten the amount of time, the amount of life that we get out of it. It's gonna make it shallower and hotter and deoxygenated. The fish species are gonna start to struggle and so forth, okay? With that erosion, we're also gonna get more nutrients dumped in, and toxic algal blooms are expensive and smelly and dangerous and just a huge problem. So we gotta wrestle with what's the resistance, what's the resilience from impacts for each activity in your park, especially in places like this ecotone, especially in places like the alpine transition ecotone, and so forth. Make sense so far? All right, cool. So, which among our vegetation species here are helping us in our recreation mission to launch kayaks one way or the other? Which ones are helping us? Take a look under your feet right now. Are you standing on grasses? Okay. Are you standing on mosses? A little bit of both, okay? Are you standing on any root structures of trees? Probably, but a little bit further down. So, the more trees we have, the more root interpenetration we have, and the more soil is stabilized. All vegetation is going to help us stabilize soils to some extent, but not all plants, species, not all growth forms. Another way of sort of classifying plants, growth form might be grassoid versus prostrate and clinging like a moss versus erect and upright and woody like a mature tree is, and so forth, okay? So grouping things by life form is a useful kind of summarization or grouping tool for us as recreation land managers. But right underfoot, if you have grasses and you step down, it lays down and it doesn't immediately spring back up from being prostrate, but it starts coming back up. And after a day or two, you'll have no idea that I was standing here. For most visitors, after 15 minutes, they're gonna have no idea you were standing here. But the plants, right, to the extent that they're getting injured or having to use those biological reserves of stored sugars or starches, stored water, available sunlight, to regrow, to heal over those injuries, if they have to grow erect again versus being able to spring back up vegetatively, they care a lot about whether we were here yesterday or 15 minutes ago or what have you, and how many times and the way in which we were doing it. So stepping and lifting at low speed is going to be among the lower impact trampling approaches. Running at a higher speed is going to be a higher impact kind of trample. Rolling with a wheel is going to be really very low impact in terms of soil erosion. But turning at high speed on a bicycle or off-road motorcycle, extremely, extremely damaging to vegetative material, like tearing, shredding, ripping, and throwing. I mean, it's like, it's Doom Eternal with the Hard Rock soundtrack all the way through. Rip and tear, rip and tear. Okay? So, we want to take a look at this. Tree is stabilizing this bank right here. So, imagine in your mind's eye 50 years from now under kind of a best case recreation management scenario where 100% of visitors are on that path behind us. For those of you listening at home, we're at Campus Lake, right at the shoreline, and we've got a tree growing right at the shoreline. 50 years from now, under optimal recreation management where everybody is basically being invisible to the ecosystem in terms of their impacts by being on the paved trail off of this soil, off of this vegetation, the shoreline's going to be not what it is now. Wave action is going to kind of nip away at this, erode the shoreline, chew into the edge of the shoreline here, away from the tree, and not here at the tree. Does that make sense? So think about all of these cypress knees and knobs poking up out of the ground. And some of those are poking up sort of at the waterline. Some of them are growing up out of the drier soil up top here. What that does is it physically armors this soil, this vegetation, which is also rooting through and holding the soil particles in place, absorbing that wave energy or that foot energy of somebody stepping here and letting that energy just kind of go away so that the soil is still there for the next time a little wavelet hits and starts to chew away at the shoreline. Now, in your mind's eye, imagine 50 years from now, a much less maybe optimal system where we are launching 1 million kayaks a year from this spot. And this tree is still here. And the nibble or gnaw or chunk chomped out of the shoreline here in the direction of the path, which is currently, 40 feet away from the water, 30, 40 feet away from the water. It's going to be a lot closer there, and it's going to be this shallow, sort of muddy ramp, real soft soils, very compacted from use, and under a lot more wave erosion potential. It's going to be silted out here. It's going to be hot, sunny, deoxygenated in that water. This end of the lake starts dying because of the kayaks and the pressure that they're putting on the vegetation to launch and return. All right? So, as with all branches of forestry, we're going to have to sort of look at your park from where we come from, when was this park founded, why was it founded, what conditions was it founded under, was it a bunch of old reclaimed farmland like the Shawnee, was it a bunch of beautiful, mostly natural places like some of you are in charge of managing this semester? Where are we at now? What's the use pressure these days? Kayaks were not a thing until fairly recently in human history. At least in a recreation sense. We've had kayaks for a very, very long time for subsistence hunting. The Aleuts, native Alaskans from the western Alaskan island chain pointing towards Russia, they've been cruising on open ocean waves at up to 50 miles an hour in their ocean kayaks for like centuries and millennia, you know? But creek boats, play boats, fiberglass, all that stuff's polymer boats, that's all super new. And that means a new kind of pressure on this landscape. So where are we at now? And then 50 years from now, kind of running things forward as it is now, or as you would have it, as you would modify it as a function of your park management this semester, what's it going to look like? So if kayaks are a huge and growing recreation activity in the United States, where we love getting out for a lot of good reasons on kayaks, we can't necessarily rely on the vegetation cover to do an ecosystem service for us. We may have to armor it up synthetically past that. One of our basic principles for this class we'll come to over and over is intensive use has to be managed intensively. So these trees will help us hold the line on shoreline as much and as long as they can, but it's kind of up to us to understand where the limit is for each one of these species in context each season. All right? When you actually get on site with a place, you're working at a park next summer or wherever, we're going to nuance this a little bit further beyond what's the resistance and resilience each season for each species under each kind of recreation, to what kinds of extrema in seasonality is going to be present with climate change. So for example, if our shoreline here at Campus Lake is temperate southern midwestern oak hickory mixed hardwoods with some sort of trash species in there as well, that's fine. Like that's a pretty productive forest environment. This is going to continue to have forest on its own. It's got some pretty well penetrated invasive species too, but it's going to be okay without a lot of help for the most part in some places, as long as we're doing like basic wildland fire management, stuff like that. But if we continue on our current business as usual carbon emission path, which we are currently, that tracks very closely with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's worst case scenario, that is called RCP 8.5, and we're looking at most likely about a 4 to 6 degrees Celsius change in average annual global surface temperature, which is a lot. And we're not going to have the climate of Southern Illinois in 50 years here. It's going to be a little bit more like Oklahoma or northern central Texas. So in your mind's eye, running your current park status forward 50 years, we want to know, is kayak use trending up if people are using kayaks at your park? Or backpacking, or wilderness use, or hiking with your family dog is always popular and more popular. People spend billions of dollars on their animals as pets. What's the trajectory of those? And what's the moving target on what our climate's going to be like in 50 years or 100 years for your particular park, okay? Don't worry, you don't have to figure that out yourself. There are really complex but detailed models on how our climate is going to change and evolve and in places collapse over the next 50 to 100 years. We're going to look up what those forecasts are for your particular park under the trajectory that we're currently on, RCP 8.5, and under something that is a little bit more like what the Paris Climate Accords and other agreements would try and aim us towards, carbon neutral as a planet by about 2050.
So are you seeing that in park management when people are really starting to take the climate change data into account, or is this very new?
It's not really new, but doing anything about it kind of is.
Tools to be able to
Yeah. So even 10 years ago, we didn't have some of the climate models that are really scarily detailed. You can watch individual heat waves roll across places and watch the death counts go up, like almost like a county by county level, if you want to think of it that way. The next generation stuff is going to be a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer cube grid simulation of the entire Earth's surface and the atmosphere up to 25 miles or whatever it is, the inner atmosphere. And you get some pretty good info out of that. It's from models like that we figured out Carbondale is going to look a lot like southern Oklahoma real soon now. So that informs where we're going with your projects in this class. Okay, let's bring it back down now to vegetation management, vegetation resources, rec management. So, our goal for vegetation in understanding your particular park is, what are those key species of interest in places like shorelines? We don't need a detailed list of 150 species, but something generally representative. So if your park was Shawnee National Forest, we would say what probably 3 or 4 species kind of dominant of interest as far as vegetation goes. Remember, not just trees. So take what you know about Shawnee National Forest and the species that are there versus what should be there. What's probably the top 3 or 4 to keep an eye on right now and for the next 50 years? Oaks, hickories, perhaps the maple. Probably want to throw in Japanese stilt grass, walnut, hopefully. That'd be nice. Johnson grass, autumn olive, you may have heard of it. Multifloral rose. Okay. So, for water, we're generally pretty aspirational. Like, we've got some ponds, we've got some rivers and lakes and stuff like that. In each of your parks, we've got the Atlantic Ocean or the Caribbean. I always say that wrong. It's not Caribbean, it's Caribbean. Think about the short list of vegetation species, and then, again, take it through our short list. Which of those are likely to be pretty resistant to impacts? Pretty resilient to impacts, or not? Relative to the kinds of recreation that we want to do. Where rock climbing is the one and only kind of recreation at your park, if it's a pretty vertical-looking park, then some grass is pretty good. Later on, if we find out that you have a bunch of like goats that are feral or feral hogs that have infiltrated your park, grasses might be a difficult thing, okay? We haven't quite got to the wildlife part of things yet, so hang on there. So, short list of species of interest of vegetation. Are they resistant and or resilient relative to the specific kinds of recreation present and the range of seasons present on site in the range of elevations and transition zones that you have present on site. Okay? So oaks are bog standard and not interesting in some places, and they're crucial keystone species in others because of the mast that they produce, the acorns, right? The food source for all sorts of different species, including some subsistence oriented humans that love acorns and all the stuff you can make out of them. So we're making a biological assessment of these oak trees are slow growing, they're hardwoods, they're probably pretty darn resistant to trampling impacts if they're already established. We can run a trail by large oaks and even softwoods, maples, stuff like that, if we have to. And it's not a problem here in Southern Illinois. In other places, maybe those oaks are just hanging on at the edge of their range, or maybe this is the only valley that particular species of oak is found in anywhere in the world. That's fairly common to find in parks. Remnant species from before the last ice age hang on in one little valley. and your park happens to be wrapped around it, and that oak species is completely unremarkable in terms of its ecosystem services, but it's completely unique in being a 350 million year old species like ginkgo or something, I don't know. And it's just in that one place anywhere ever. Okay? Cool. So, we'll have a little bit of time here to break off into groups and decide who wants to look at the high altitude stuff, mid elevation, low elevation stuff, how you guys want to sort of parse out figuring out what's the veg profile for your particular park and each of those criteria for it, okay? Would anyone like to hear the list of things you want to evaluate for each of those species one more time? So you can write it down. All right, so for your species on your short list, which are critical to sustaining that ecosystem, or are the primary invasive threats, non-native invasive threats, or that might be charismatic to visitors like giant sequoia, coastal redwoods, people care a lot about them, they dominate the ecosystems, etc. Just qualitatively, just on a high to low scale, not attaching any numbers to it, don't worry about that at this level. Is it resistant? Not resistant. Is it resilient or not resilient? Across the range of seasons, and in your key elevation bands at high elevation and low elevation, and relative to the specific short list of primary ways people are coming to your park to recreate. How's that kind of looking for your park, for that short list of species? You can do it as a table or as a bulleted list or however you want to format it. That's less important to me. And what's your climate going to look like in 50 years? Now, that last question we're going to answer together because there are good models and resources to do that, and they're a little bit hard to find. They're not really generally available to folks who are not climatologists. But there are a couple of places where we can access that pretty easily. So we'll take out that last part together when we get to the climate section. But keep an eye on that for what these might be. If you're already aware, just, reading things about your park that it's going to dry out like crazy over the next 100 years under climate change, if the temperature range is going to change rapidly, keep that in mind. Can your key plant species kind of tolerate that? Or are they going to get forced out? Are they going to get forced off the top of the mountain from that sky island effect we talked about just briefly earlier in the topography section of class, where it gets hotter and hotter all the way up, and the alpine obligate species get pushed right off the top of the mountain. It's too hot for them to come down. They'll die. Okay? Cool. All right. Any questions on vegetation stuff? I finally got the online class stuff unsnarled, so I'll start linking each of those sections out to you so you don't have to go digging in the content section of our course website to find the PowerPoints and stuff like that. But we'll get you all squared away with that stuff. Any questions about the vegetation side of your resources? Cool. So, this is a senior level class. We are taking forestry, as a thing, and making it part of one class session, and the rest of the class session is all the other kinds of vegetation in your park that are not trees, and moving right on to other classes of forest rec resources from there, and contextualizing it tightly to your park at a senior level. Sound good? Cool. All right. Let's make one more stop on our little show and tell tour in this area for veg, and then we'll finish up. If anybody's trying to get along the path from that side and I don't see them, just let me know and we'll make a hole. All right, so this is just a brief blurb, mostly for folks who haven't, come up through our forestry program in the past, haven't had a chance yet to take a bunch of forestry classes. So we're looking this way instead of out at the lake for the moment. When you're kind of compiling your list of usual suspects on your national parks website, they're usually mostly charismatic species and rare, threatened, or endangered species listed for vegetation resources, but also especially for wildlife. So we want to kind of evaluate the list of what you see on the National Park Service website for your chosen park a little bit differently maybe than like a typical visitor would. So we want to think about what are the overstories or top canopy species and how dense are they? Is this closed canopy forest we're talking about, generally speaking? Is it open canopy discontinuous? It's called woodland instead of forest. Or is it isolated individual specimens like at Joshua Tree, for example, where you couldn't even call it a woodland. It's just like individual trees here and there, providing little small islands of shade and water capture and nutrient cycling and that sort of thing. All right, then under that we've got mid-story. So this is generally, for our purposes in this class, going to be species that are trying to come up to get to the canopy or that have given up on that competitive strategy and are staying elevated over the forest floor cover. Okay? Everything that's upper level canopy is probably generally, unless it's one of those exception species like beech, birch, aspen, some sycamore, etc., probably going to be pretty resistant to impacts. That'll be pretty quick. Mature trees are generally going to be all right. Mid-story stuff, much more vulnerable because they're competing just as hard for a lot less resource availability, primarily sunlight. Okay? So mid-story species that you identify on your short list, those are going to be ones that may not have as much resilience because they got to work a lot harder to get any sunlight. Okay? But most importantly for us, because most of our forest recreation activities are going to be focused on contact with the forest floor, literally, through our boot soles or treads or hooves or whatever. This is going to be some smaller tree species, but mostly all the non-tree species that we haven't maybe learned about in any of our other forestry classes so far. Things like forbs, which are going to be those non-woody green vegetative members of your community, like ferns, for example. Very low resistance to impact, moderate to extremely low resilience from impact. One trampling pass on most kinds of ferns will kill the fern for that season. If it hasn't seeded out, there's not going to be a fern there next year. Okay? So, in some ecosystems, a single pass through is going to make a trail. Legit. In summer camp out west, we saw some examples of cryptobiotic crust. That is one of those ecosystems. The vegetative cover there isn't even strictly vegetation. It's just like a crust of algae and fungi and lichen and stuff. Then we've got woody vegetation, which is low shrubby stuff. Low bush blueberry, for example. It's pretty resistant to impact because it's wooden and cellulosic branches. But once you snap those, it's like breaking the bones of the thing, and the plant's just not going to grow back in that area. So it's got some resistance by virtue of its size and density, but very low resilience. You walk through a patch of low bush blueberry at Acadia National Park, and that trail is going to be there for a generation because the plants just can't grow right there. And it's a nutrient-poor soil, whatever. Doesn't matter for that particular example. Okay? Cool. So think in, especially if you're kind of new to this forestry side of stuff, think in terms of 3 bands vertically when you are looking in your mind's eye through the vegetation structure of your park. Okay? Got a couple minutes as we're walking back to decide who wants to do which parts of it, and we'll come back on Monday of next week. We'll meet on a Monday for the first time in almost a month. It'll be exciting. Cool. This ends your exciting tour through forestry from your home computer.